All right, welcome back, everyone. Um, Topic of today's lecture is good design. And let's get started with an example. Let's say you're thinking of an idea, any idea, and you're thinking, you come with this brilliant plan to build a car. And you have this great visualization for how this car is going to look in your brain. It has these beautiful wheels, it has this nice metal exterior, it has these nice doors, it has these lights, etc. It has all this functionality that you understand and that you've planned for and completely. But when you go to build it, perhaps you might end up with a failed prototype. You might end up with some wonky functions. You might end up with some mislabeled or improperly working code and that kind of stuff. And so your product doesn't turn out as intended, and it's bad for both you and your users. And so this lecture is trying to get you to avoid this kind of situation by using good design. And the first thing that we want to think about with this is trying to think from the user's perspective. This is like a really important way to think about way to think about your application before you actually start working on it. Ask yourself these questions. Ask yourself what do you want to see displayed on your page? What features make sense to incorporate into your application? And how should the flow of the website go? This is a question. These are all questions that we'll go ahead and talk through over the course of this lecture. These things, however, like what users see and what features they use are all encapsulated in what you might have seen before, something called user experience. This is also really closely tied to the user interface, or UI. User interface in this case is the physical thing that the users interact with on the page. But these two things are pretty closely interrelated. If you go into a quick Google search for UX, you might see something like this. There's a bunch of different diagrams and a lot of different buzzwords that you'll see that people use to talk about UX design. We're not going to go into this super in depth. We're not going to go into the theory and whatever. But we'll go through there's a bunch of different things rapid fire to consider when you're working on your projects that you should take into account in order to make basically a better designed app. So here's a few things to consider. The first is aesthetics. So a lot of these things might seem really small or insignificant, but they can actually add a lot to the way that your website feels and the way that users will how much users want to use your website, which is really important. So at least for aesthetics and font and formatting, you want to make sure that the font you use is readable and that it also gives your website the right feel. And by that I mean if you were to use Times New Roman, for example, to invite someone to your super awesome bouncy castle birthday party fun day, the vibe that you're giving off with this font is not exactly the same. It's not what you might want, what you're trying to convey with the text, right? Also, if you're telling someone that they have a disease, you shouldn't use Comic Sans because that's not the correct you're not giving the right atmosphere when you're using this kind of text. So in addition, if your ambulance has Comic Sans as the font on the outside, I feel like that is giving the wrong message. And so you want to be able to present a cohesive theme when you're using this kind of font and formatting. Another thing to take into account is visuals, and I'm going to show a couple of examples to help illustrate this. So if you go to a website like Calm, for example, the whole deal, right, is this website is trying to advertise a meditation app. It's trying to help you find your inner calm and your inner peace or whatever. And the visuals in the background, right, the mountains and the scenery, as well as the really simple font and the really plain buttons, they're trying to evoke this kind of emotion, I guess, from you, which is that you should be mindful and you should be meditative, and it should be giving off that kind of vibe. Whereas something like Discord, right? There's a bunch of bright colors in the background, the background is supposed to be bright purple. You have all these interesting characters on the corners. There's a lot of really vibrant colors. If you go to the actual site, you see little sparkly animations in the background. It gives a different impression, right? The impression it gives off is that this is a place where you can be kind of quirky and you can have different kinds of community. The two websites that we're showing here, they have different visuals and they both serve to illustrate their purpose. Another thing to take into consideration is audio. And this is one thing that you might not think too much about, but I'm gonna give a couple examples, right? So the one of the example you can think about is the lightsaber battle from Star Wars. You can think about how weird it would sound if it was muted, or if just the lightsaber effect was taken out, right? They're something that's very iconic and something that's very it's so common that that it's there that when you take it out, it's actually very jarring, right? Another thing that I like to think about is like I use Discord a lot, and if I were to like Discord has all these like cute little sounds like play when you like enter a voice channel or you leave a voice channel. They all add to the experience in some way because it also makes your site feel more responsive in a sense, right? There's like little like sounds and like things that you can listen to that make things more satisfying to do or satisfying to experience. Another thing to think about is styling and theming. So I'm just going off and listening to these rapid fire. You can take any of these or none of these into account, but they're all important design elements. So one thing here is to think about is if you have ask if you have a consistent theme and if it fits the idea you have in mind for your app, right? This is an example of, so I'm going to show the example of which is ant design. And if you scroll on their website, you might see some of these like different boxes, different components. And you might see you might end up on this page where you see like all these different like icons and like these different like platforms and that kind of stuff. The impression that gives off, right? There's a lot of like really like simple colors, really like well done logos. Everything's neatly organized and like packaged in their own individual like boxes. It seems very professional and clean, and it seems like this is something that someone with like a design mindset, or someone who wants to be creative can go in and leverage these products to be able to do that kind of thing. This is like the theme that it gives off with this kind of design. Whereas something like this, right? Backgrounds like the text is like super like jarring. There's like a lot of like bright neon colors. The background's like really dark and edgy. Like the vibe it gives off is slightly different, right? The theme here is more so like futuristic and like very techy, where and less so like professional and clean. Another example here is like Pusheen. So this site is like obviously very cute. And the reason for this is like they have all these like bright pink colors in the background. You have like all these little details. Like if you look in the bottom right, like bottom left-hand corner, you can see Pusheen like doing this over the newsletter. There's a lot of like small little touches. Like another thing like you think about is like the font, right? So the font right here doesn't have serifs, so it's like very like cutesy and like bubbly. A lot of the things like I don't want to use the word squishy, but that's like the vibe it's giving off, right? It's giving like it's giving it a very cutesy and very adorable vibe when you go to this page. So one of the things to take into consideration is website flow. And by this, I will give you an example, which is Facebook. So if you go to facebook.com and you just log in, you'll see like this infinitely scrolling feed. And this is an example of like a flow that you might use in your website, right? So if you're going onto Facebook, you're a user, you can just instantly log in and go through all these different posts like all at once, and you don't have to do anything special or do anything like super difficult like on the user side, right? All this like behavior from the user is like very intuitive, very easy to use, right? And even if you're not interested in like scrolling through all these posts, you can like very easily navigate to like any of these functions all across the top page, like the right side or the left side, and get to what you want in that case. Like the flow is very intuitive and it feels very like easy to use. Another example is like this main screen. So I'm gonna use this example to illustrate like ways your user might try to use your application. So if you're IMDb, right, your user might either be like looking up a particular show, they might be like looking like to browse like different types of shows like that are really popular today, right? So like there's like these two different flows that are like working together. The first is like on the very top bar, right? You have like this really big search bar, and this is like to incentivize users to like try and like pick out like a show that they like and like go ahead and like, search it up, right? But if they aren't really super interested in a particular show, they can go ahead and they can go like scroll through like all these different like really popular trailers and like browse through different trailers as well. And they can explore that way as well. So these are two different like ways that like the user can like intuitively use your app. Right? Because like if you're not really interested in like searching through something, what you're gonna do is you're gonna try to scroll through the rest of the page, right? And see like what else there to offer. Okay. This is a pretty big one. It's intuitive use and control. So you want to make sure that like the buttons on your page make sense and that it's obvious to click them, right? It's pretty annoying to deal with something like this, right? If you're using like a website and there's like a place to add a phone number, you don't want to like try to enter the exact number with like individually with a slider. This is like a bad practice. Don't do this. Another thing to think about is responsiveness. So you want to make sure that users feel like they are in control of the site at all times. Like a good example of this is like hover and click. And this is like something that's really small, but if you go into Chrome actually, and you go into like a new tab, and you open like a new tab, and like you do stuff on that tab, and then you switch back to like another one. If you hover over like the tab, the color of the tab actually changes to reflect that you're hovering over it, and it also shows this little preview of what's going on in the tab. And it's like really cool because it means like the site is like is looking at your behavior and trying to respond to it accordingly. And this is like, and yeah, this is really cool. This is a good example of responsive design. Another thing to think about is like the event loop and asynchronous functions. So you might have in your application, you might be like getting a lot of data from your database, or you might be like doing a lot of like asynchronous calls. And you should make sure that like it doesn't like slow your entire site down when you do that, right? You want your site to feel like responsive, and it shouldn't like wait for other things to finish completing, like wait for like you to get a bunch of data before you do anything else. Try to like have things going on in the background, such that using like async and like got then and that kind of stuff to make sure that you're not like ending up situations where like the user just sitting there waiting for your site to work, right? That's not good practice, and it's not very responsive. Okay, another big one is robustness. So what does this mean? Robustness means that like your site doesn't break. And when you're making up your site, you might be working really hard. And when you're finished with it, you might send it off to see what a user will do with it. And you might expect that like a user is like just like you, right? They understand how the site works perfectly. They know all the little like intricacies and where to go to like get everything done. But this is usually not the case, right? Because the user doesn't know like doesn't know your intentions when you program the website. You also might expect that the user is like some MIT intellectual who knows everything about the site, who can figure it out all on their own. But this is also not usually the case. And in actuality, the user looks something like this, because you honestly cannot really predict, like, or you honestly like, I don't want to say this, but users can do a lot of really stupid things. And this is coming from me as a user of many websites. They'll try to do things that like you might not expect, or they do things that are really unintuitive or won't make really sense. It won't make a lot of sense to you when you're programming your website. And you need to be able to anticipate this, because if things can break, they absolutely will. And you don't want them to break when like someone's creating your website, right? You want to avoid the situation at all costs. And to do this, we're going to do something called bug fixing, which is making sure that everything on your site works as intended. And there's an illustrated diagram of this. Yeah. One thing that's super important is that your server or client should not crash or error constantly. This is like pretty self-explanatory, right? Like if your server crashes, you actually have to restart your entire server. And that means that during that time where it's crashed, no one else can access your site, which is really bad, right? You don't want like someone like messing with one person to like bring down your entire operation, right? That's not something good. You want to avoid situations like these at all costs. And to do this, you want to basically just like be the evil like user, and try to crash your server in as many ways as possible. Think of as many ways that it can break, and then try to go ahead and fix them, right? You're basically just breaking stuff down, and then going back and trying to fix it, and then doing this over and over again, switching between trying to break your server in different ways, and then going back and trying to fix it. Like I said, crashing is really bad. And the way you want to solve these like different problems, in terms of like a priority, is you want to basically try to minimize the extent of the impact, right? If your server is crashing, you definitely want to tackle that first before looking at any big bugs, and before looking at any small bugs, and before looking and like this is it's better to tackle the bigger issues first, right? And finally, once you're done with all of that, right, it's also good to check for other non-fatal errors. Stuff like game logic not working properly, or something not being super intuitive, or like different warnings that React might give you. These are all things to also take into account. So look at your console and make sure that you are not like giving a bunch of errors, and that you're trying to solve them. Okay, there are a bunch of different ways that you can take up and approaches you can take to fix different bugs. Let's say it's like 5 a.m. before the night of your project is due. Well, if it's a pretty simple fix, but it's a Band-Aid fix, you can probably just go ahead and do it. Because these things all depend on like whether or not you have enough time, or whether or not you have enough expertise. But if you have a lot of time, right, you should just go ahead and try to like rebuild it from scratch. because like Dylan mentioned in the good code lecture, you want to be able to reduce code debt, and this is a really good way to do that because Bandai fixes are a very good way to make sure that your code is unreadable really fast. So a good example of a Bandai fix is actually with Messenger. So if you use this app, you'll notice that there's this thumbs up button at the right. And if you click this, you'll see a little thumbs up emoji pop up in the chat. And what you used to be able to do is you used to be able to spam this and send a bunch of different emojis. Send the thumbs emoji a million times. But if you did this, Facebook would actually give you a warning. So please slow down. Since they don't want to deal with all this influx of information. You're calling the database. It's not really useful. And it's really easy to do this because if you're thinking about how to spam text or whatever, you have to go through and type it up. Whereas this, you can just mash a single button, right? The thing is that this warning actually didn't mean anything because it Facebook didn't do anything. You can just click confirm and you can go back to mashing the little button. And this is an example of Bandai fix, right? Because even though it's not actually doing anything, at least to the users, right? Users can see that this is something they're not supposed to be doing. They can be scared into not wanting to spam this button in the future. And now actually, if you try to go and you open the Messenger on your phone and you mash the emoji button, it actually doesn't spam at all anymore. It rate limits the number of emojis you can send in a given time period. So that's an example of how a Bandai kind of hacky fix is converted into a better, more well-structured fix to this problem. Actually, though, there is another workaround, I guess, for this right now, which is that if you send, Facebook actually also introduced stickers, and if you are like Mr. Nick over here, you can spam 75 stickers to other people, and there is no consequence for this. So you can try this out when you have time in the future. Okay. One of the things to consider is handling edge cases, and edge cases in this case are situations that might not arise, situations that seem very outlier or not really common. But these are also really important to take into account because they're not that they don't happen that often, but they are really bad when they happen, right? So stuff like what happens if the user has a really bad internet connection and they keep dropping dropping frames, or they're not really or they keep disconnecting from your site. Do you want to make sure that their progress is saved on your site? And do you want to make sure that everything seems to be working for everyone else who's using the site? That kind of thing. And the thing about is what if you close the tab at random times, right? What if you're filling out a form or something for a job application and you close the tab halfway through? Does your progress save or will it break? If you have sensitive information, it might be good to actually close fully clear up the form every single time you exit, just to prevent anyone from pulling up the tab again, seeing your sensitive information. These are all things to take into account as well. What if you open web pages that should only be accessed in certain ways? So going back to the form example, right? If you're filling out a Java application and there's 8 pages and you're on page 3, and then you suddenly you decide to send this the link to the application to your friend or something like that. Will the application open on page 3 or will it open on the home page? This redirection is something that you should try to take into account as well. And it might not happen super often, right? But this is something that it's a good question to ask, right? What happens to your page? Because this is something that's it helps with the intuition of how to use your website as well. What happens if you leave the tab open too long and then Google OAuth decides to log you out automatically? Is your progress saved? Is it rejected? What goes on there as well? This especially applies if you're playing a game, right? What happens if you're playing a multiplayer game? You open multiple tabs on the same page. Are you allowed to make multiple actions all at once? What's going to go on here? This is it's really weird to think about, but this is stuff that you should consider. There's so many different ways to mess with this. Like I said, it's a lot to think about, but it's important to think about as well. It's important that you try to think of every single way to break your app. Okay, one of the things to consider, especially if you are a true gamer, is lag and optimization. So you want to avoid situations like this where the lag is incomparably high. And how do we fix this? Well, right now we haven't seen anything like this yet, but you're going to end up deploying your sites on Heroku. And Heroku honestly isn't that great. It's pretty weak compared to something like Google, right? This is we're using the free student tier. It's not really able to handle a lot of processing on its own, and it's kind of not GigaChad. So a couple of ways we can go about like speeding up computations, even with Heroku, is trying to minimize the number of like computations by trying to reduce unnecessary and repetitive computations just in general. If you're like go through your application and like try to like wait until the last minute to like, if you really don't need this like data to be computed now, you try to wait until later when it's absolutely needed and then compute it. Another thing you should try to do is try to bundle your communication into packages. And this means that like, it's usually better to send like batched data rather than like single messages. And this is also good because if you're sending like individualized like messages for like every single like bit of data, you might end up losing some along the way. Whereas if you send it as a batch, right? You're not gonna end up with like an incomplete set of data that might give you like a wrong impression, right? So it's usually better to send like stuff as a big batch rather than sending it stuff individually. As an example, right? So the really big bottleneck here that like with Heroku is that the communication between client and server is like really slow. And basically the client should try to do everything on its side first without like doing any server communication. So stuff that's like particle effects or like animations, it should all be done client side before getting any information from the server. The idea, like an analogy here is that like if I'm like working on a PSET and I'm working on it with Nick, and we can only communicate by carrier pigeon every like 3 months, like we're probably going to try to get most of the PSET done on our own before we send any carrier pigeon like communication. Yeah, so this is the whole idea. One of the things we try to do is have the server trying to prune itself. And what does this mean? So like if you have some like unused or like some unused data or stuff that's taking up space on your server, you try to like delete it, right? So a good example of this is like if you are making like a game where that requires like game lobbies, right? What happens when the users like just decide to like leave a lobby, right? Does the lobby stay open? And if it does, it like it might like slow down your server, right? So it's good to like try to like prune this down and like delete or remove any unused data that might be on your server. Okay. Another thing to consider, sorry, it's a big list, is feel. And you basically want your site to feel as satisfying as possible to use, right? Stuff that's like, this is like something that's like very small to consider, but they can really impact how much a user wants to use your site, right? Stuff like that's like really cool animations, like or particle effects, or like screen share, really cool colors. They want like stuff that draws the user's eye in and makes them want to keep using your app for a really long time. So like, here's an example of like a really cool animation. Like if you move it, I don't know this is from, but if you move your like cursor around, it like influences like the trajectory of all these particles. And it's like very mesmerizing, right? You can take a look at, you can like just like watch this, and it doesn't even matter what the rest of your site does. You can just like have this on there and probably like cool enough. Or stuff that's like still like animation, right? It's like 3 frames long, but even though it's like really short, it's really cute, and it actually adds a lot to the feel of the site. It feels like it's very responsive and it's like very alive, right? In a sense. As I mentioned before, right? Sound and music. So it's pretty easy to, if you go online on Google, just like find some like royalty-free or like copyright-free like music and sound effects. And these can also add a lot to your site. They can also make it more entertaining. You can add the Vine boom to every single button that you do. I don't know. That's up to you. Okay. One of the things to consider is like having fluid and natural movement. This is also really important if you're making a game. And the thing is that like if you press a button, right, to like move your character like left or right, they don't actually like instantly reach the top speed, right? They take a little bit of time to accelerate the top speed. And then as long as you're holding that button, they'll like sustain the top speed for a little bit. And then when you release the button, like it'll decelerate before actually coming to a stop. This is like a more natural like form of, this is like how movement naturally works, basically. And you want to try to like maintain this in your game, right? You don't want to end up with like super robotic or like erratic movement unless you're really intending for that to happen. So make sure that you try to incorporate this if you're trying to make a game or something like that. One thing to consider is input buffer. So I think that the illustration here is not super relevant, but if we have like, if you remember from like the snake game, right, earlier last week, if you were to press like multiple buttons at once, you would notice that like it kind of wouldn't like respond to what you were doing. Like if you were like about to hit a wall and you're mashing like the right button or something like that, and then you suddenly click the up button, it might not like respond to it immediately. And this is the lack of an input buffer is why it does that. So basically if you're holding down an input, right? In like the last few like phrases before you release that input, any other input that's like you put in and that you put in that time is going to put in what's called a buffer, and it'll like register that input right after you release the first input. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. I will look up more about this if you're curious. But it's basically a way to make your site like your inputs to a game in particular feel more responsive, and also make your game feel more easy to use. You don't want like your player to have like a one frame input to like do everything, right? You want like stuff to have a little bit of leeway as well. Speaking of games, right? A lot of applications will incorporate like different walls, right? And if you're moving like not like perpendicular to a wall, you're moving slightly along it, you should take into account like the physics of this, right? It should not like come to a complete stop if it touches the wall, unless that's what you want. It should kind of like slide along the wall, moving like slightly like adjacent to it. Okay. I would say it's really important to focus on like what's the most interesting features of your sites, what's like the stuff you really want to show off, and make sure that they shine in your application. Don't hide them away. Put them at the very front of your page. Finally, maybe not finally, one last thing to consider is optimizing for different devices. So we talked about this before, but like you want to make sure that your site doesn't break if you like resize the page, or if you like open it up on a different like on a different platform. There's all different ways for you to like automatically style and resize the page depending on like the constraints of the page. So final remark is that it's easier to enjoy the idea of your application when the implementation is good. We're going to be grading you both on idea and implementation, but when the implementation is really good, it really enhances like the feel and the look of your idea. The best part is that it should all be fun. It should all be a really fun experience to have to work with like different like sound effects, different like visual effects. We want you to have a good time, and feel free to come ask any of us if you have trouble with it. Thank you.